Number 1. Sidney Rezo. The first thing the responding officers noticed was the car. A white Volkswagen Quantum station wagon sat at the foot of a driveway in Morris Township, New Jersey, on the morning of April 29, 1992. The engine was running. The driver's door was open. There was no driver. A neighbor had seen the vehicle idling and called the police, and when officers arrived and could not locate the man who owned it, they reached the conclusion that would define the next 2 months. The car's owner had been taken from the end of his own driveway. That man was Sidney Rezo, 57 years old, the president of Exxon Company International, the division of the Exxon Corporation that managed the company's operations outside the United States. He was a Louisiana native, a petroleum engineer by training, who had spent his career climbing through one of the largest corporations in the world. He was the father of 5 children. He lived in a comfortable home in a quiet, wooded part of Morris County, and his daily routine was almost mechanical in its regularity. Each morning he would leave the house and stop at the end of the driveway to collect the newspaper before continuing to the Exxon facility in Florham Park. That regularity, investigators would later determine, was precisely what made him a target. Someone had studied it. The people who had studied it were Arthur Seal and his wife, Irene Seal, both 45 years old. Arthur Seal's history is central to understanding the case because it explains how the abduction was planned with such specific knowledge. Seal had grown up in Hillside, New Jersey, where his father had been a police officer. He attended Admiral Farragut Academy and later served as a police officer in Hillside himself during the 1970s, a tenure that was not distinguished. According to John O'Rourke, a 26-year New Jersey state trooper who later wrote a book about the case titled Mystery, Millions and Murder in North Jersey, Seal had been reprimanded 7 times in 10 years on the Hillside force. He then went to work for Exxon, where by the mid-1980s he held a position in the company's security operation at the Florham Park facility, eventually serving as a security manager. One of the responsibilities of that role was the protection of company executives from exactly the kind of threat he would later carry out. Seal left Exxon in the late 1980s to pursue private business ventures, including an attempt to run a furniture and interior design business in Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. The ventures failed. The Seals accumulated substantial debt, described in court proceedings as on the order of several $100,000, and moved back to New Jersey to live with Arthur's parents. It was against this background of financial collapse that the couple, according to the case prosecutors later laid out, began planning a kidnapping for ransom in late 1991. They considered more than one Exxon executive before settling on Rezo, in part because his home in Morris Township was situated in a way that made an abduction more feasible. The day of the crime followed the timeline investigators reconstructed afterward. On the morning of April 29, 1992, Rezo pulled to the end of his driveway. Irene Seal, who according to her later testimony had jogged past the Rezo home for weeks recording his morning habits, was part of the operation. Arthur Seal confronted Rezo and forced him toward a waiting rented van in which there was a wooden box. During the struggle, Arthur Seal's handgun discharged and Rezo was wounded in the forearm. He was bound, placed in the box, and driven away. The box was taken to a rented storage locker in Washington Township, New Jersey, an enclosed space with no climate control, where, according to the account author Philip Jett gives in his book Taking Mr. Exxon, the temperature soared to 100 degrees inside that box. Rezo was held there. He had been shot, the wound was not adequately treated, and the conditions were severe. He died on or about May 3, 1992, 3 to 4 days after the abduction. The medical determination of the cause of death was consistent with heat exhaustion compounded by the untreated injury. What makes the Rezo case unusual is that the kidnappers continued their ransom scheme for weeks after the victim had already died. The Seals had forced Rezo to record statements before his death, and they used those recordings along with a series of written notes to convince Exxon that he was still alive. The notes demanded $18.5 million in used $100 bills to deflect suspicion. The kidnappers presented themselves as radical environmentalists. Their notes were signed with variations on the name Warriors of the Rainbow, and they invoked the Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989 and the 1985 sinking of the Greenpeace vessel Rainbow Warrior, in which the photographer Fernando Pereira had been killed. One signature misspelled his name. Greenpeace publicly denied any involvement. The eco-terrorist framing was a deliberate misdirection. The investigation became one of the largest of its kind the Bureau had undertaken. According to Philip Jett's account, it surpassed the 1960 kidnapping of Adolph Coors III to become the FBI's third-largest kidnapping case. After the Patty Hearst and Lindbergh baby cases, more than 100 FBI agents were assigned. The Bureau worked the case on several fronts at once. Agents analyzed the ransom notes. One of the letters contained hair from a golden retriever, and the seals owned a golden retriever. Investigators traced the kidnappers' telephone calls, which had been placed from payphones, and they noticed that the notes and letters had been left in locations that only a person with detailed local knowledge of Morris Township would have known. That observation pushed the Bureau away from the environmentalist theory and towards someone with intimate familiarity with the area. The kidnappers had also demanded a cellular telephone for ransom communications, apparently believing cellular calls were harder to trace. According to a spokeswoman for the Morris County Prosecutor's Office, the seals were mistaken about that. It is worth noting, for accuracy, that some later retellings claim DNA recovered from the ransom envelopes identified the seals. That claim does not appear in the contemporaneous 1992 reporting, which instead credits handwriting analysis. The golden retriever hair traced payphone calls, eyewitness accounts, and the physical break at the final ransom drop. The break came at that drop. On the evening of June 18, 1992, a sequence of notes and phone calls moved FBI teams from location to location across Morris County. At one point during this relay, agents conducting surveillance at a shopping area in Chester, New Jersey, observed a man wearing rubber gloves using a public payphone. An agent recorded his license plate as he drove away. The vehicle was a rental car. Although the rental agency in Hackettstown was closed, its owner agreed to meet investigators, and the records showed the car had been rented to Arthur Seal. In the early morning hours of June 19, 1992, around 1 o'clock, Arthur Seal was arrested when he returned to the rental agency, and Irene Seal was arrested shortly afterward. Inside the couple's vehicle, agents found items consistent with the ransom operation, including laundry bags of the type the callers had requested, rubber gloves, license plates, and a directory of Exxon executives' home addresses. Within days of the arrests, Irene Seal began cooperating with investigators. She provided a detailed account of the planning and the confinement, and she led agents to the location in the southern New Jersey Pine Barrens, in the area of Bass River State Forest, where the couple had buried Resso. His remains were recovered on June 28, 1992. The prosecution proceeded on two tracks. The lead federal prosecutor was Michael Chertoff, then the United States Attorney for the District of New Jersey, who years later would serve as Secretary of Homeland Security. Because New Jersey law at the time prevented one spouse from being compelled to testify against the other in state court, prosecutors structured the case so that Irene Seal's cooperation could be fully used. The federal system permitted her testimony, and Arthur Seal ultimately pleaded guilty rather than face it. In September 1992, Arthur Seal pleaded guilty to federal extortion and related charges and to state charges including kidnapping and felony murder. At sentencing in late November 1992, before United States District Judge Garrett Brown in Trenton, Chertoff sought and obtained the maximum federal term of 95 years. Judge Brown also imposed a fine of $1,750,000, structured specifically so that Seal could not profit from any book or film about the crime. In state court, before Superior Court Judge Reginald Stanton in Morris County, Seal received a sentence of life with no parole for the felony murder and an additional consecutive 30 years for the kidnapping. 3 of Resso's children gave statements at the hearings, asking for the maximum sentence. Irene Seal, under her plea agreement and in recognition of her cooperation, received a sentence of 20 years. She served her time in federal custody and was transferred to a halfway house arrangement in June of 2009, after which she was supervised by the United States Probation Office in Illinois. Arthur Seal remained in federal custody, where over the years he completed graduate study and he later sought compassionate release. His applications acknowledged that he could not change what he had done. Everything in the case returned to that first observation in the driveway: the running engine, the open door, the missing driver. The car at the end of the driveway had told the responding officers that a man had been taken from the most ordinary moment of his day, and the investigation that followed, built on hair evidence, handwriting, traced phone calls, and a license plate recorded at a payphone, eventually accounted for every step between that idling station wagon and a grave in the Pine Barrens. If you are finding this kind of research-based court record account useful, you might consider subscribing to the channel. We work through these cases the way the investigators did, in order from the evidence, and subscribing helps us keep producing them. Number 2. Barbara Jane Mackle. The case that the FBI would eventually solve began, in evidentiary terms, with an abandoned car and a photograph. When investigators recovered a Volvo that kidnappers had left behind after a botched ransom exchange near Miami in December of 1968, inside it, they found documents bearing 2 names and a photograph of a young woman lying in a box, holding a sign that read, "Kidnapped." That photograph was both a ransom proof and, ultimately, a piece of evidence that helped identify the people who had taken her. The young woman was Barbara Jane Mackle, 20 years old, a student at Emory University in Atlanta. She was the daughter of Robert Mackle, a Florida land developer and a co-founder of the Deltona Corporation, a major home building company that contemporary accounts described as a $65 million enterprise in 1968. The Mackle family lived in Coral Gables, Florida, and were prominent in the state's development industry. In December of 1968, an outbreak of the Hong Kong flu swept the Emory campus, and Barbara fell ill. Her mother, Jane Mackle, drove from Florida to Atlanta to care for her and bring her home for the Christmas break. Because the university infirmary was overwhelmed, mother and daughter took a room at a roadway inn in Decatur, Georgia, near the campus. The 2 people who took her were Gary Stephen Christ, 23, and Ruth Eisenman Shear, 26. Christ's background was extensive and troubling. Born in 1945 and raised partly in Alaska, he had a record of crime stretching back to his teens. In 1966, he had escaped from the Dayul Vocational Institution, a California state prison, where he had been serving a sentence for automobile theft. Another prisoner died during that escape, which, under California law at the time, exposed Chris to capital liability if he were caught. He relocated to the Boston area and assumed a false identity, calling himself George Deacon, and obtained work in scientific settings, eventually participating in a marine science expedition. Through that work, he became connected to the University of Miami's Institute of Marine Science, where he built ventilated boxes and met Eisenman Shear. She was a graduate student in marine science, originally from Honduras, the daughter of Austrian Jewish refugees. The 2 became involved, and Christ disclosed his true identity and criminal past to her. They formed a plan to finance a new life by kidnapping for ransom. The day of the crime was December 17, 1968. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, Christ and Eisenman Shear knocked on the door of the motel room. Christ, presenting himself as someone bringing news of an emergency, said that a friend of the family, identified in accounts as Stuart Hunt Woodward, had been in a traffic accident. Believing the report, Jane Mackle opened the door. The 2 entered, subdued Jane Mackle using chloroform, and bound her, and took Barbara Mackle to a waiting car. They drove roughly 20 to 30 miles to a wooded area off South Berkeley Lake Road near Berkeley Lake in Gwinnett County, Georgia, just off Peachtree Industrial Boulevard. There, they had prepared a reinforced fiberglass box, roughly the size of a small coffin, set into a shallow excavation. The factual conditions of the box, as documented in news coverage and in Mackle's own later account, were these. It was fitted with an air pump and 2 ventilation pipes that reached the surface, a battery-powered lamp, a small supply of food and water, and a fan. Christ photographed her holding the "kidnapped" sign for use in the ransom demand. The box was then covered with earth. The ransom demand sent to Robert Mackle was for $500,000 to be paid in $20 bills. The first attempt to deliver the ransom went wrong. As the exchange was underway near Miami, 2 police officers on routine patrol happened upon the scene, and the kidnappers, believing they had been detected, fled on foot, leaving their car behind. That abandoned Volvo became the investigative turning point. Inside it, agents found the photograph of Barbara Mackle in the box and paperwork in the name of George Deacon. A second ransom drop was then arranged through intermediaries, including local clergy. And on December 19, 1968, the money was successfully delivered. The investigation moved on parallel tracks. The FBI traced the name George Deacon to the University of Miami's Institute of Marine Science, where they learned that Deacon built ventilated boxes and spent time with a colleague named Ruth Eisenman Shear. Separately, a man in Georgia who had recently purchased a small trailer contacted authorities to report that he had found unusual paperwork inside it letters addressed to both George Deacon and Gary Christ. When investigators compared fingerprints, they confirmed that George Deacon and the escaped California convict Gary Christ were the same person. Meanwhile, the most urgent task was finding Barbara Mackle. On December 20th, 1968, Christ telephoned the FBI and provided approximate directions to the burial site. The Bureau set up a base in Lawrenceville, the Gwinnett County seat, and more than 100 agents spread across the area, searching the ground by hand and with whatever tools they could find. They located the site and uncovered the box. Barbara Mackle had been underground for approximately 83 hours. She was recovered alive, dehydrated, but without serious injury, and was reunited with her family. Chris did not remain free for long. Tracked toward Florida, he had used ransom money to purchase a boat, an action that drew suspicion when he paid in $20 bills, and a large search effort involving aircraft and a substantial number of officers pursued him. He attempted to flee on foot through swampland and was arrested. Authorities recovered the large majority of the ransom money. Eisenman Shear proved harder to find. She traveled under aliases, supporting herself with low-wage jobs, and evaded capture for 79 days. She was apprehended on March 5, 1969, in Norman, Oklahoma, after she applied for a job that required fingerprinting, and the prints were matched. She had the distinction of being the first woman placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. The legal proceedings were handled in Georgia. Christ was tried in Decatur in the spring of 1969. Before trial, a psychiatric evaluation found him competent to stand trial and described him as highly intelligent with a character disorder but no psychosis. He was convicted of kidnapping and, in 1969, sentenced to life in prison. Eisenman Shear was extradited from Oklahoma to Georgia, where she pleaded guilty to kidnapping and was sentenced to 7 years. What became of the two of them is among the most unusual aftermaths in American criminal history. Eisenman Shear served 4 years, was paroled, and was deported to Honduras. Christ was paroled after serving about 10 years. He then campaigned for and eventually obtained a pardon that allowed him to pursue a medical education. He attended medical schools abroad, earned a medical degree, and after several states declined to license him, the Medical Licensing Board of Indiana granted him a probationary license in December of 2001, with conditions including periodic reporting and psychiatric evaluation. That license was revoked in 2003 after it was determined he had not been forthcoming about disciplinary matters in his record. In 2006, Christ was arrested in connection with a scheme to smuggle cocaine and undocumented immigrants on a boat off the coast of Alabama, and he was sentenced to a federal prison term. In 2012, a federal judge in Mobile, Alabama, United States District Judge Cali Grenade revoked his supervised release after he left the country without permission and sentenced him to a further term. Barbara Mackle returned to her life. She later married, had children, and in 1971 published an account of the case, written with the Miami Herald journalist Gene Miller, titled 83 Hours Till Dawn. The book and the case became the basis for television films. The case had begun, for investigators, with that abandoned Volvo and the photograph inside it, a single image meant to extort a family that instead helped identify the people who had taken their daughter. Every later step, from the fingerprint comparison that exposed the George Deacon alias to the phone call that gave up the coordinates, flowed from the evidence that the kidnappers, in their haste at the bungled first drop, had left behind. Number 3. Annie Laurie Heron. The evidence in this case began with a piece of paper on a floor. On the evening of July 26, 1988, a man named Robert Heron returned to his home in the Woodland Hills section of Jackson, Mississippi, and could not find his wife. While searching the house with his son-in-law, he discovered a ransom note on the floor of the entry hall. There were also drops of blood on the carpet and smears on the front door. The note did not demand money in the ordinary sense. It demanded that Robert Heron pay 12 named people whom, the note claimed, he had wronged in a business dispute. That single, strange instruction, pay these specific people, is what eventually allowed prosecutors to identify and convict the man behind the plot. The woman who had been taken was Annie Laurie Heron, 72 years old, born Annie Laurie Swaim in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in November of 1915. She had met Robert Heron while both were students at the University of Alabama in the late 1930s, where she had worked as the women's editor of the student newspaper. The couple married and settled in Jackson, where Robert Heron became one of the wealthiest men in Mississippi, with interests in banking, oil and gas, and insurance, and connections that included a stake in a professional football team. By the late 1980s, the family's estate was valued between $100 and $200 million. Annie Laurie Heron was a fixture of Jackson's civic and cultural life, a patron of the symphony, a leader in the Opera Guild and the Junior League, a co-chair of the State Arts Festival. She was also frail. She had a chronic intestinal condition, ileitis, that required daily medication. A supply of that medication was found to be missing from the home. The day of the crime, as later reconstructed in federal court documents, was ordinary until it was not. Annie Laurie Heron had hosted her regular bridge club at the house that day. The card playing began mid-morning, and the last guest left in the early afternoon. The housekeeper departed around 3 o'clock, leaving Annie Laurie Heron alone. When Robert Heron came home in the late afternoon, he saw her car in the driveway and assumed she had gone out with friends. By evening, he was concerned, and the authorities were called late that night. The blood in the house matched Annie Laurie Heron's type, and investigators came to believe she may have been struck during the abduction. The man who would be convicted in connection with the case was Newton Alfred Wynn, a civil attorney from St. Petersburg, Florida, who was in his mid-60s at the time. Wynn's connection to the Herons ran through a company called School Pictures, a school photography business associated with Robert Heron. Wynn had held a school pictures franchise. In the early 1980s, the company sued Wynn, alleging he had failed to make required payments and had taken money from a trust account meant for processing photographs. After litigation, in 1984, 4 years before the kidnapping, Wynn was ordered to pay the company more than $153,000. When he did not pay, the obligation grew with penalties, and under court orders, the company moved to seize his assets, including stocks, vehicles, real estate, and ultimately his law office and the apartment behind it where he lived. Wynn's name was one of the 12 listed on the ransom note. By July of 1988, the process of evicting him from his office was advancing. The investigation that followed was lengthy and depended heavily on the conduct of people around Wynn. In the days after the abduction, the Jackson news media agreed to withhold the story for about 24 hours so that law enforcement could work. The case was announced publicly at a press conference held by the Jackson mayor, Dale Danks. On the evening of July 28th, investigators searched for a white van with Florida plates that neighbors had reported seeing near the Heron home, and witnesses said the driver matched Wynn's description. As the federal investigation progressed, two people connected to Wynn became central. The first was Don Ward, a paralegal who worked for Wynn. Ward had made multiple trips to Mississippi in the period before the kidnapping, photographing the Heron home and business at Wynn's direction. After the abduction, Ward initially provided a false alibi for Wynn, telling the FBI and a federal grand jury a fabricated story. He later recanted, cooperated, and was granted immunity. The second was Marilyn Taylor, a former girlfriend of Wynn's, who testified that Wynn had paid her to fly to Atlanta under an assumed name and mail an envelope. She testified she did not know the envelope contained a ransom note written in Annie Laurie Heron's handwriting. The handwriting was its own piece of evidence. In mid-August of 1988, after Robert Heron had made a public appeal for his wife's return, the family received a letter postmarked from Atlanta, Georgia, written in Annie Laurie Heron's hand. It urged her husband to comply with the demands of these people, and closed, "Please save me, Annie Laurie." The reference to these people, prosecutors would later argue, was itself evidence that more than one person was involved in a conspiracy. After receiving the letter, Robert Heron mailed nearly $1 million to the 12 people named in the original note. A check of $145,000 was sent to Wynn. Either Wynn or his attorney returned it. Wynn was arrested on March 11, 1989, in Florida, on federal charges of conspiracy to kidnap, extortion, and perjury. It is essential to be precise about what he was and was not charged with. Prosecutors did not charge Wynn with personally carrying out the abduction. As the lead prosecutor, Assistant United States Attorney James Tucker told the jury, the government could not prove that Wynn was the man who stood at Annie Laurie Heron's door. Instead, the government charged that Wynn had plotted the kidnapping and attempted to extract payment from Robert Heron out of, in the prosecution's words, revenge and anger over the loss of his assets. The trial was held in federal court in Jackson before United States District Judge Tom Lee. Assistant United States Attorney Patricia Bennett delivered part of the government's closing. Wynn was represented by defense attorneys including John Collette and Ed Marger, who argued that the government had tried the wrong person and suggested that others had carried out the crime and framed Wynn. Two of Wynn's associates had received immunity in exchange for their testimony. In early February 1990, after deliberating for several hours, the jury convicted Wynn on all three counts: conspiracy to kidnap, mailing a threatening communication, and perjury before the grand jury. On April 20th, 1990, Judge Lee sentenced Wynn to 19 years and 7 months in federal prison to be served without parole, along with a term of probation to follow. Wynn maintained his innocence throughout. He served 16 years and was released in April of 2006. He died in 2012. The case is best understood as partially resolved. A conviction was obtained, and the legal system identified Wynn as the person who conspired to kidnap Annie Laurie Heron. But no one was ever charged with the physical act of the abduction, and Annie Laurie Heron was never found. Investigators came to believe she did not survive long after she was taken. Robert Heron died of a heart attack in November of 1990, 2 years after his wife disappeared, and before the appeals in the case had run their course. Annie Laurie Heron was declared legally dead in 1991. The case has been featured on the program Unsolved Mysteries, and a memorial bench stands near Robert Heron's gravesite. As a footnote that has long haunted Jackson, a 7-year-old girl named Daphne Tullos disappeared from a different part of the same city on the very same day, July 26, 1988. Her case is entirely separate, has never been connected to the Heron matter, and remains unsolved. The whole prosecution turned on the peculiar instruction in that note found on the entry hall floor, the demand that Robert Heron pay 12 specific people. It was an unusual ransom, and it pointed, by its own logic, back towards someone with a specific grievance over a specific business deal. The paper on the floor named the motive, and in the end, the motive named the man. If these cases are holding your interest, consider subscribing so the next one reaches you. The channel exists to lay these investigations out plainly, from the first piece of evidence to the final judgment, and your subscription is what keeps that work going. Number 4. Frank Sinatra Jr. In this case, 2 small pieces of physical evidence eventually anchored a federal prosecution. A latent fingerprint found on an envelope at a house the kidnappers had rented, and another latent print on the roll of adhesive tape used to bind a witness. They were modest items, but in 1963 and 1964, they helped tie 3 men to the abduction of a teenager from a lodge at Lake Tahoe. The teenager was Frank Sinatra Jr., 19 years old, the only son of the singer and actor Frank Sinatra. The younger Sinatra had been trying to build a musical career of his own, performing with a band on a touring circuit, and in early December of 1963, he was booked to appear at Harrah's Club Lodge at Lake Tahoe on the California-Nevada state line. He was, in the language of the case, a target of opportunity chosen for who his father was, one of the most famous entertainers in the world, and for the wealth that fame represented. The men who took him were Barry Keenan, Joe Amsler, and John Irwin. Keenan was the planner. He was 23 years old, a former high school classmate of Amsler's from Los Angeles, and had once been a strikingly young success in the financial world, reportedly among the youngest members of the Los Angeles Stock Exchange. After a car accident, he had become addicted to painkillers and had fallen into financial ruin, and he conceived of the kidnapping as a way to recover, telling himself he would eventually repay the money. Keenan recruited Joe Amsler, also 23, and John Irwin, an older man who worked as a house painter and who was to serve as the contact for ransom communications. Keenan had considered other targets, including the sons of other celebrities, and had planned an earlier attempt that was disrupted by the assassination of President Kennedy on November 22, 1963. The day of the crime was December 8, 1963. At about 9 o'clock in the evening, Sinatra was in his room at the lodge with a friend, the trumpet player, John Foss, when there was a knock at the door and a man said he had a delivery. When the door opened, Keenan and Amsler, both armed, entered. They bound Foss with tape and took Sinatra out to a waiting car. Foss freed himself within minutes and alerted authorities, and roadblocks went up quickly. The kidnappers, however, talked their way through a checkpoint near Carson City, explaining that they had stopped to remove snow chains and drove south. Sinatra was taken to a house on Mason Avenue in Canoga Park, in the San Fernando Valley area of Los Angeles, where he was held. The investigation involved the FBI from early in the night, with field offices in Reno and elsewhere brought in. The Bureau's standard recommendation in a ransom case applied here: wait for the demand, pay it, and track the money. Through Irwin, the kidnappers contacted Frank Sinatra Sr. and on December 10th demanded $240,000. Sinatra agreed. By some accounts, he offered far more, and the kidnappers held to their original figure. The FBI recorded the serial numbers of the ransom bills. The money was delivered in the early morning hours of December 11th, left between 2 parked school buses at a location in the Sepulveda area. While Keenan and Amsler collected the money, Irwin, who had grown nervous, released Sinatra. The young man was found walking in the Bel Air section of Los Angeles, alerted a private security guard, and, to avoid the press, was brought to his mother's home in the trunk of the guard's vehicle. The case unraveled quickly because one of the conspirators could not keep quiet. Irwin told his brother about his role, and the brother contacted the FBI office in San Diego. Irwin then confessed directly. Keenan was arrested on December 13th and Amsler the following day. The great majority of the ransom money was recovered contemporary accounts, put the figure at roughly $234,000 of the $240,000. Beyond the confessions, the Bureau gathered physical evidence at the Canoga Park house, including the latent fingerprints, and there was also a written record. Keenan had earlier composed a kind of confession letter and placed it in a safe deposit box, a document that undercut the defense's later theory of the case. The trial took place in federal court in Los Angeles in early 1964 and lasted about a month, presided over by United States District Judge William East. The defense, led by attorneys including Gladys Root and George Ford, advanced a theory that became the lasting controversy of the case, that Frank Sinatra Jr. had arranged his own kidnapping as a publicity stunt to advance his career. The prosecution rebutted it with the physical and documentary evidence, and the jury did not accept the defense theory. All three men were convicted. Judge East imposed severe sentences. Keenan and Amsler received life plus 75 years, and Irwin, who had cooperated, received 75 years. One side note emerged at trial: the singer Dean Torrance of the duo Jan and Dean, and a friend of Keenan's, acknowledged having loaned Keenan money and having known of the plan. He was not charged. The sentences did not stand as imposed. Keenan qualified for psychiatric evaluation, and an examiner concluded that his judgment had been so impaired by painkiller addiction at the time of the crime that he was likely legally insane when he committed it. On that basis, the sentences of Keenan and Amsler were reduced to roughly 24 to 25 years, and under the parole practices of the era, the men served only a fraction of that. Amsler and Irwin were released after about 3.5 years. Keenan served roughly a year longer. In 1967, in connection with appellate proceedings, Irwin pleaded to reduced charges and was placed on probation. The later lives of the three men diverged sharply. Barry Keenan went on to substantial success in real estate development and made a great deal of money. In the years that followed, he was, at various points, open about the case, and he sought to profit from telling his story, efforts that, in the 1990s, prompted legal action from the Sinatra family over the rights to the account. Keenan struggled with mental health problems over the course of his life. He was interviewed about the case repeatedly in later decades and became the subject of films and audio projects. He died on November 13, 2022, at the age of 82. Joe Amsler worked for a time as a stunt double and in other jobs, and died in 2006. John Irwin largely disappeared from public view after his release. Frank Sinatra Jr. continued his music career and spent years conducting and performing his father's repertoire. He was, by his own account, long shadowed by the publicity stunt theory that the defense had floated, a claim he firmly rejected. He died of cardiac arrest in March of 2016 at the age of 72. The case closed, in the end, the way it had been built on the evidence the men left behind. The defense could spin a theory about a publicity stunt, but the fingerprints on the envelope and the tape, the recorded serial numbers on the recovered money, and the confession letter waiting in a safe deposit box were facts that did not bend to a story. Those small items, gathered in the days after a teenager was walked out a side door of a Lake Tahoe lodge, were what the verdicts ultimately rested on. Number 5. Charles Geschke. The case was effectively broken at the ransom drop, and the key fact was a name. When the FBI recovered a handgun that one of the kidnappers had abandoned in the sand dunes near the money drop, agents traced the weapon, and the man they later detained nearby shared a last name with the gun's registered owner. As one agent put it, at that point, there was no doubt he was the kidnapper. From that connection, the location of the victim followed within hours. The victim was Charles Geschke, known as Chuck, 52 years old in 1992, the co-founder and president of Adobe Systems. Geschke had grown up in Cleveland, Ohio, the son and grandson of letterpress photo engravers. He had studied for the priesthood for several years before leaving the seminary, earned degrees in classics and mathematics from Xavier University, taught mathematics, and then completed a doctorate in computer science at Carnegie Mellon University. He went to work at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, where he eventually established and led the Imaging Sciences Laboratory and hired John Warnock. In 1982, frustrated that their research could not move into commercial production at Xerox, Geschke and Warnock left to found Adobe Systems, naming it after a creek near their homes. The company's PostScript technology helped launch the desktop publishing revolution, and by 1992, Adobe was a substantial and growing public company. Geschke was its president and a wealthy man, which is what made him a target. The men who took him were Mohanad al-Bukhari, 26, of San Jose, and Jack Saye, also rendered as Ahmad Saye and known by the nickname Rock 25, of Campbell, California. Al-Bukhari was a Syrian native who had studied criminology at a California community college. His wife was expecting the couple's second child at the time of the crime. Saye had emigrated from Jordan in 1987 and was, in his family's later description, an immature young man who was easily led. The two had known each other only a couple of months before the kidnapping. Both were unemployed, and the scheme was one of money. The day of the crime was May 26, 1992. As Geschke arrived for work and parked in the Adobe lot in Mountain View, California, the two men approached his car. They called him over as if to ask a question and then took him at gunpoint. The abductors blindfolded him by placing cut pieces of tape over his eyes and covering them with sunglasses so that, from outside the car, nothing would appear amiss. They told him that if he tried to escape, they would harm him and his family, and they made threats about explosives. He was driven to a small house, a bungalow in Hollister, California, where he was held, at times chained, for the next several days. He was not, by his account, physically harmed beyond the conditions of his confinement. The kidnappers contacted Geschke's wife, Nan, by telephone and demanded a ransom of $650,000. The FBI, brought in immediately, monitored the calls. The investigation became, according to the Los Altos town crier, the biggest FBI search of its kind since the kidnapping of Patty Hearst nearly 2 decades earlier. The plan for recovering Geschke turned on the ransom drop, which the family carried out. Geschke's daughter, Kathy, drove the family's Cadillac to the drop location and left a backpack containing the money. The backpack had been fitted with an electronic tracking device, and Kathy wore a protective vest and was supported by a large law enforcement presence in the area. Al-Bukhari, who was waiting nearby with a gun, took the bag and fled on foot into foggy coastal dunes. He abandoned the gun and his shoes in the sand and discarded the bugged backpack, and for a period, he evaded the search, which involved local police, a SWAT team, and helicopters. Through the night, he tried and failed to obtain a ride from a cement plant worker, and eventually, apparently believing the search had moved on, he walked out onto a road and directly into a team of agents. He told them he had simply slept on the beach, but the abandoned handgun had been traced, and it bore the same last name as his. Agents took him to a nearby motel room for questioning. They impressed on him that if Geschke were killed, he could face the most serious penalties, and after what one agent described as a gentlemanly discussion, Al-Bukhari agreed to cooperate and led them to the house in Hollister. On May 30th, 1992, after 4 days in captivity, Charles Geschke was freed, unharmed. The two men were prosecuted in the California State Courts of Santa Clara County, and their cases proceeded very differently. Mohanad al-Bukhari chose to plead guilty, a decision his public defender, Tim Fukai, said at the time was made in part to spare the Geschke family a lengthy proceeding. Both Nan and Chuck Geschke spoke at his sentencing. Al-Bukhari's case concluded within about 5 months of the crime, and he received a sentence reported as life plus 20 years. Jack Say, by contrast, demanded a trial, and his case took nearly 2 years to resolve. He was tried in February of 1994, represented by the attorney Bernard Bray, who argued that his client was a naive and unsophisticated young man who had not grasped the gravity of what he was involved in, and who, by the steps the kidnappers took to conceal their identities, had intended all along to release Geschke. The jury convicted Saye of kidnapping, robbery, and making terrorist threats, while acquitting him of weapons charges. He was sentenced to a life term, with the court noting he could become eligible for parole consideration after a period of roughly 12 to 13 years. At the sentencing, Geschke spoke and asked for the maximum penalty, and stated his conviction that the two men had intended to kill him. The defense and Saye's family disputed that, pointing to the measures the men had taken to hide who they were as evidence that they planned to let him go. Both men received life sentences in state prison. Charles Geschke returned to his life and his company. He and the Geschke family found the experience lasting and difficult, his wife described. Years of unease in their home, and the family eventually moved to a different house, but Geschke continued to lead Adobe. He served as the company's president until 2000, when he retired from that role and remained co-chairman of the board for years afterward. He accumulated numerous honors in computing and was active in education and philanthropy. He died on April 16, 2021, at the age of 81 of cancer. The resolution traced directly back to that abandoned handgun in the dunes. The kidnappers had taken care to blindfold their victim, to use false names, and to disguise the car so that no passerby would see anything wrong but a weapon left in the sand, registered under a traceable name. Was the single fact that connected a man walking on a coastal road to a bungalow in Hollister where a hostage was waiting, end quote. The drop that was supposed to end in a clean escape instead produced the evidence that ended the case. Closing. 5 cases, separated by as much as 3 decades and by the whole width of the country, and yet the patterns are hard to miss. In every one of them, the victim was chosen because of a family's wealth or prominence, and in every one of them, the planning included a period of watching, learning a driveway routine, following a concert tour, photographing a home, studying a daily schedule. The crimes were calculated, and they were, in their own terms, businesslike. But the same calculation that made them possible also generated the evidence that solved them. A license plate recorded at a payphone, a photograph and paperwork left in an abandoned car, a peculiar ransom note that named a motive, fingerprints on an envelope, and a confession in a safe deposit box, a handgun left in the sand with a traceable name. In each case, the people who planned so carefully left behind the very thing that identified them. The outcomes were not the same. Barbara Mackle, Frank Sinatra Jr., and Charles Geschke survived and returned to their families. Sidney Resso did not survive, and his case became a murder prosecution as well as a kidnapping case. Annie Laurie Heron was never found, and her case stands as a partial resolution. A conviction obtained for conspiracy, a motive established in court, but no recovery and no charge for the physical act. What unites them is not how they ended for the victims, but how they ended in the record, with people identified, with cases brought, and with judgments entered. That is what makes them, in the strict sense, solved. They are a reminder that the work of an investigation is patient and procedural, that it advances one piece of evidence at a time, and that even the most carefully planned crimes tend, in the end, to leave a trail that someone can follow. If you found this documentary valuable, please take a moment to like the video, leave a comment with the case that stayed with you, and subscribe to the channel for more research-driven, court record accounts. Your support is what allows us to keep producing this work, and we are grateful that you spent this time with us.